Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Health Matters with Laura Kopec. I'm your host, Laura Kopec, traditional naturopath, functional practitioner, functional nutritionist, economic specialist, life coach, and podcast host. And we welcome you to another episode. For those of you that have been listening to my podcast, you know that I'm really specializing and identifying and really taking apart the way we view certain aspects of our health, unpacking it, demystifying it, debunking it, cutting through the BS, a lot of the myths and misconceptions that we have about matters of our health. And today we're going to really talk about mental health. I think mental health has broken a lot of its stigma over the past few years. And I hope that the conversation keeps growing and changing and we learn more and more about mental health. I think we need to understand that much like our bodies can get sick, sometimes our mind can as well. And it can be short-term or long-term, just like our bodies. And so I think if we can look at it that way, then we can have more frank and honest conversations. Mental health has become one of my specialties in my practice, and you may wonder why. Why has it become a specialty? And part of it is because I see results. I see the body and the mind do amazing things when the cells are put in the right environment. And the mind and our mental health is not too dissimilar from our physical health. The first thing is that we're really starting to understand the brain in a different way. We're starting to understand it's not rigid. You may have heard the term neuroplastic. It's one of the ways that we refer to the brain. It's more sponge-like, and it functions a lot like our gut. So it will absorb nutrients. It relies on essential fatty acids. It relies on a number of things to help it maintain its fit. And like our body, stimulation, exercise, rest, it requires all those good things that make up good health. So one of the most fascinating things I think about the brain is the fact that as a sponge, it's not just absorbing nutrients and maintaining an equilibrium, but it also goes through its own detoxification. Part of that happens when we sleep. So one of the things that happens is, and if you're familiar with the way that I like to educate, is that I like to use a lot of analogies. So the sponge. And so, if you will, a very simplified way of talking about this is that during sleep, our brain shrinks in size. So it's like that sponge is being squeezed. And inflammation, which is a general term that we can use to describe anything that is in the body that at some point we hope will be eliminated and removed. So part of what happens is the brain shrinks in size, and inflammation is supposed to exit through the cerebral spinal fluid, and it's part of the detoxification process that happens during sleep. So much like the body, we're going to digest and absorb nutrients, and then we're going to detoxify and eliminate inflammation during sleep. Like the body, if the inflammatory load is too high, then inflammation has a harder time leaving. So the brain is not nearly as fixed and rigid, and a lot of our mental health may be more related to chemical imbalance that are actually nutrients that are actually become nutrient deficiencies. So one of those ways of thinking about the nutrition of the brain, I talked about essential fatty acids. Those are some really good things like omegas. You may have heard of that term before, but one of the things that we don't really think about in terms of mental health is protein. And protein doesn't necessarily have to be animal protein, but protein becomes amino acids, and then those amino acids are the precursors to a lot of neurotransmitters like serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, epinephrine, and those really drive whether or not they can be classified as excitatory neurotransmitters. And excitatory are the ones that really give us the lift. They really help us feel good. They're motivating. People with issues in their dopamine receptors or carrying excitatory neurotransmitter deficiencies may have symptoms of depression, like anxiety, may also be a part of it. They may experience low motivation. They also may struggle with addiction. Those are just some of the things that may be associated with having those nutritional deficiencies. And so we don't really think about protein in that way, that's really an important part. And of course, protein is going to be acidic if we don't pair it with those alkaline foods like vegetables. So I always say our protein is only as good as the vegetables we put it with, and can be really undervalued and not nourishing as much and not absorbed properly if we're pairing it with those starches that can slow things down. So let's talk about those foods that also will have an inflammatory effect on mental health. Gluten is one of them. Gluten is a protein found in wheat. We typically don't really even think about wheat or white flour when it comes to the brain, but even if your stomach can digest it, one of the things that I tell people is that if you have mental health imbalances, then you really need to consider staying away from things that are highly inflammatory to the brain. Gluten is up at the top of the list, so is sugar. Both of those can be super inflammatory to the brain. And again, even if you feel like you don't have an issue digesting it, I think a lot of people think, well, if I tested negative for celiac, or if I don't have a gluten intolerance, then it is not something I should avoid. But we need to have really big and honest conversations about how the food we're eating is really affecting our brain, and then in turn affecting our mental health. So it's a pretty important thing to start to think about, well, what am I doing? How do I eat for my brain, right? And things like candy and soda and all those things containing high amounts of sugar, they may feel like a little bit of a lift, but there's a crash that happens on the other side of that. And a lot of times, the balance between dopamine and serotonin is being really disrupted. And sometimes those foods are creating deficiencies in those neurotransmitters. Sometimes those foods are creating an overflow of those nutrients, where the body may be in a sense, flooded with serotonin, in a sense, having excessive amounts of dopamine. Or the body could go into kind of a fight or flight response, because if there's an imbalance in neurotransmitters, dopamine and serotonin, you might find on the other end of that cortisol is too high or too low. The body doesn't understand how to navigate its fight or flight response. And particularly, I find that sometimes women might think that they're having a hormonal issue, and it's not specifically hormones like estrogen, testosterone, progesterone, or kids might be having an attention issue, and that might not be it. It might really be that the way that they eat inflammatory foods to their brain is really creating an inflammatory issue that is manifesting itself as a symptom in mental health. So nutrition is really important, and it's something that we really don't even think about when we talk about brain health. Okay, one of the things I also want to talk about and add here is something called the Dopa fast. And this is part of that lifestyle piece, because I think one of the things that we don't also really think about and understand is how important it is to create this space that actually allows dopamine to be generated and stored. So let me take that back a little bit. Dopamine, again, it's that excitatory neurotransmitter. When I say dopamine, there's really a collection of them: dopamine, epinephrine, norepinephrine. They all motivate, lift, excite. And in the anticipation of something is where the most amount of dopamine is manufactured and stored. We live in a world that moves us even closer and closer to timeless, immediate gratification. And the more immediate gratification we have, and the less delayed gratification, the more we deplete this area which we are supposed to Dopa fast. We are supposed to fast from that constant stimulation so that we can create this anticipation that will store dopamine. It's only gotten worse as we have moved through the pandemic. We do everything online. We have cut travel time. We have cut shopping. It's all about immediate gratification. And we don't have a chance to allow our brain and our body to just build and store those chemicals. And delayed gratification isn't just about the dopamine and the dopa fast. You know, they've done incredible studies that talk about what happens when delayed gratification is in place. They did studies with young children and watching that if they could delay their gratification in a longitudinal study, they found that the outcomes in those individuals were better. Success, relationships. In general, somebody who is better with delayed gratification can be better at resolving conflict. So there's tremendous benefits to learning delayed gratification, to taking that opportunity all the time to pause, la pause, if you will. It's one of the terms that the French use when they're raising children. And it's a place of awareness, and it's a place of just considering that being grateful and having gratitude might just be about taking a pause and allowing those chemicals to store and lift us in a place where we weren't before. Okay, let's go on to the second part of this, and that is genetics. A lot of times people say, oh, that's in my genetics. Oh, that's in my family history. And one of the things that I really encourage people to do is think about their genetics a little bit differently. And in most cases, when we talk about, oh, there's a family history of this, or this is in my genetics, it very well could be that there is genetic risk, because in most cases, that's really what is being talked about is genetic risk. And that genetic risk is very, very vulnerable to diet and lifestyle habits, very vulnerable to the nutrition that a person eats. And often what is passed on that we call a family history of illness and disease is actually the habits, the personal habits of diet and lifestyle. We learn how to eat in the home, that we experience those meals together as family, and those habits. If sugar is in the house, then a person might be more likely to develop an addiction to it. And a lot of times, a lot of people in the same house may be experiencing the same kind of mental health issues. And it's because everybody could even be eating the same thing, and again, following those same habits. The other side to it too is that, and this is called epigenetics, and epigenetics, one of the ways to think about it is the environment that the cell is put in. So again, that diet and lifestyle piece is going to have a greater impact on whether or not that gene actually, in a way, behaves the way it's supposed to. If the gene is a variation that increases somebody's risk to something, so say there is a gene that increases risk to having dopamine issues or serotonin issues, then it is going to be that much more critical that prevention, that a diet and lifestyle plan really supports that predisposition, so that the epigenetic environment is really that best fit for a person, so that they minimize their own genetic risk, if you will. So let's talk about too, there's another piece to this genetics that I really feel is very interesting. I find the whole subject to be super fascinating. And that's if there are deleted genes, which right now, not a lot of the testing is sophisticated enough. We've learned how to sequence the whole genome, but the actual reporting of deleted genes is something that's still a work in progress. But if about 30% of the population is missing a a percentage of their dopamine receptors, then their risk might be that much more greater, because they may not even have the ability to absorb dopamine or process dopamine in the way that is going to be optimized with just nutrition alone. They need some different kind of support there that will help them really maximize that. And part of that is that there is nutritional protocols that can help create new pathways, new synapses. And again, but that, is part of a mapping and a protocol in which we really look at what support system is necessary to help a person really achieve and optimize their mental health. So the other piece of this is kind of a lifestyle piece, if you will. I think we don't give enough attention to screens and screen time, especially our phones, and how disruptive they can be to those chemicals. They can really create a problem, especially the smaller the screen. It can interfere in serotonin processing and production, and that can leave somebody a little bit more on the anxious side. And so it can also interfere in sleep. The more we spend looking at a screen, the more it suppresses melatonin production. And then that melatonin, is really necessary for a quality sleep. And without that quality sleep, we don't get into that anti-inflammatory protocol that the brain really needs to really start the day fresh and awake and rejuvenated. So I think it's really important that we start thinking about our mental health and our brain the way we think about our gut health and our body, that we can optimize that through a good preventative, good support protocol that identifies what our nutritional needs are, where are we in real time with those neurotransmitters, what is our fight or flight cortisol doing, what is our genetics, our genomics in relationship to this, and how do we make a commitment with diet, lifestyle, and epigenetics so that mental health is much more pursued as something that we can have a greater opportunity to bring back into balance and a greater opportunity to take charge of our health by thinking about it differently and feeling differently about it, and then taking action in a very, very different way. So thank you so much for joining us on this discussion of mental health. And I really look forward to doing another episode on this one. It's one of my favorite topics. I'm very passionate about it. And I look forward to another episode with you.